Welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a backstage pass to the aid and international development sector and explain exactly how it works beyond what you see in the news headlines or on TV and in social media.
I'm Lauriane. I'm the founder and director of a political consultancy called the Advocacy Team.
And I'm Alex. I'm an independent researcher, facilitator, and actor. And we are your co-hosts. So welcome to Series 1 of the podcast, where we will break down aid and development by busting key myths about the sector. We're going to outline each myth, tell you why we think they're myths, and then explain why these widely held beliefs are in fact false. So today we're introducing and debunking our second myth, so buckle up because it's a bit of a wild ride. Perhaps the most common myth about aid and development that we hear and we've heard over our careers is that foreign aid money goes directly to the people that need it the most. So look, if you thought this was the case, I promise you're not alone.
Yes, so it's a really common misperception in countries like the UK, the US, across Europe, that the money spent as foreign aid is going directly to the countries that the government is supporting. For example, I have been following very closely the response to Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica, and I've seen on social media the normal members of the public asking the government, where's the money that was sent from England? Where's the money that was sent from Canada? Where's the money that was spent? So that is a perception that exists here in donor countries like the US and the UK, but also in some cases in countries where aid is being received.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. So we'd like you to take a moment to answer two quick questions for us. Yes, it's a little pop quiz before we move on. And you can feel free to pause the episode while you think about the answers. So question number 1, how much money do the UK and the US allocate as foreign aid as a percentage of their overall budgets? So if it helps, you can think of this sort of maybe in comparison to other sectors that a government might spend money on. So something like health or education domestically. So that's question number 1.
Okay, and for question 2, remember, keep this in your mind as we're going through. Of all the money that governments put aside for foreign aid, what percentage of that money do you think goes directly to organizations from the countries receiving the support?
Okay, and feel free to take your time because these are complex questions, but we're going to give you the answers now.
Okay, so contrary to popular belief, no country spends more than 1% of its GNI, its gross national income, on foreign aid. So we'll just walk you through some examples. The US, for example, allocates 0.22% of its gross national income to foreign aid. If you take the UK once met what was seen as an international gold standard. It once spent 0.7% of its gross national income on foreign aid. I was part of the campaign to try to get that law through Parliament. But it's over recent years that budget has been slowly reducing, first down to 0.5% and then to 0.3%, or we will get to that level very shortly. And so you will hear, and people hear about foreign aid and they hear about billions being spent. Sometimes we hear billions going to Africa. So we just thought it would be useful to just contextualize that a little bit with a practical example. So if you think about the National Health Service, so just one key public spending priority for the government spends about £317 billion a year on the NHS, and its overseas development assistance budget, ODA, or foreign aid budget, was £14 billion. So that gives you a sense of the share of the total aid budget compared to just one domestic spending project. And of course, within that £14 billion, global health will be a part of it, and that will include spending for things like trying to prevent the next pandemic.
That's right. So that takes care of the overall volume of aid, but where does it actually go? A lot of people ask this question, and honestly, I'm just going to cut straight to the chase. Research shows that in humanitarian aid, which many of us hear about on the news, only 4.5% of funding is given to organizations from the countries experiencing conflict or crisis. And now an even worse statistic is coming your way, because all of the money that donor countries provide to support civil society actors. So what do we mean by civil society? We're talking here, every country has one. We're talking here about charities, non-profit organizations, grassroots movements, all of those. So of all the money that so-called donor countries give to civil society in so-called recipient countries, only, wait for it, 1% is actually given directly to organizations in the countries that are meant to benefit from the support to do whatever they need and want to do with that money. So kind of open and unrestricted funding. So I was part of a campaign called Too Southern to be Funded, launched back in 2024. And the purpose was to accompany a report that I did, and just to show how unfair this reality is. And we're going to hear a lot more about that shortly.
Yeah. And to also introduce another concept is that these donor countries have also promised not to do exactly this. So there is this concept about tide aid. It was a practice that was very popular in the 80s. It was associated with a lot of corruption. And so as a way to redress that issue, governments decided together that they would not tie their aid. By that we mean they would not make it a requirement that an organization receiving aid comes from their particular country.
Yeah. So let's give you an example, because honestly, it's really, really complicated. So let's say, for example, the UK wants to give £10 million to a health program in, for example, Malawi. So when it comes to giving money to organizations to implement this program, because someone needs to actually go and do the work, right? So the UK cannot, according to the rules, the untied aid rules that Lauriane was talking about, they cannot say, okay, we have 10 million, but only British organizations can apply. They can't do that. Great. Sounds great. In practice, however, more than 90% of contracts awarded by the UK to private sector organizations for these types of programs go to British companies.
Yes. But it is important that you keep in mind the money that we're talking about here. We're talking about the money that governments allocate to fund projects and programs overseas. We're not talking about other types of support. So to go back to that Hurricane Melissa example, one of the ways that the UK was supporting the hurricane response was by providing supplies. So they were providing things like solar lanterns because the electricity was down and is still down in some places, or they were supplying things like tarpaulin for the hundreds of thousands of people who'd lost their roofs. So we're not talking about the kind of supply element. That's important. The conversation you'll hear today is the money governments have available that they allocate to organizations for projects or programs.
Amazing. So to help us understand what's behind these unfair numbers, because numbers are just numbers at the end of the day, we are delighted to introduce our guest for this week's episode. So a huge, huge welcome to Eshban Kwesiga, who's part of the team at an organization called the Global Fund for Community Foundations, where he serves as I think this is one of the best job titles I've ever heard, the knowledge weaving and influencing manager. I want to weave knowledge. I want to influence. So tell us everything, Eshban. Eshban was born in Uganda. He lives in Uganda. We've worked together. And let me tell you, he has one of the freshest, most interesting takes, not only on aid and development, but honestly throwing those concepts out the window completely and talking about new realities and new futures, some of which already exist.
I'm excited. Eshban, thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you help us bust our myth. And let's start from the beginning. Why do you think that this myth exists, that most of the money spent on foreign aid goes directly to countries receiving support?
First of all, thank you both for having me on the podcast. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. So I think that this myth that a lot of the money from donor countries actually makes it to the recipient countries, in fact, exists because we know so little about the racist schemes of international development. The report that Alex referenced earlier was called Too Southern to be Funded, and it was done by the Shift the Power movement. So I want to spend a few seconds just talking about Shift the Power as the movement that kind of helped put this together. So Shift the Power started in 2016, both as a hashtag and as a movement. And back when it was the articulation of the idea that a lot of the bad behavior that we had seen in international development was really as a result of how those with power have used and exercised their power, and particularly funders in donor countries. And that that power had been used, first of all, it had been used in ways that were dismissive of the capacities, of the knowledge and the experiences of the people and the organizations that they funded. In the work of other movements like Black Lives Matter, Charity So White, and so forth, Shift the Power grew to mean various things to different people. And today the movement is much bigger, and it's made up of various organizations and people around the world who believe that there's something wrong with the way international development is done today, and that it's possible to do it differently. So the report was first presented to the movement by Peace Direct, who had commissioned a study to look into and to follow how does money move from donor countries to the countries that receive this money. And what they learned was that most of the money stayed within the donor countries. And that system, in fact, exists because, first of all, we also learned it was one of the best kept secrets in international aid. But it also exists because there are assumptions, racist assumptions on capacity and assumptions of guilt, fraud, that southern organizations can't be trusted with money. And capacity is also something that we can talk about later, because, we've come to learn and appreciate that it's coded language, meaning that a person cannot be trusted. If I say you don't have capacity, it's a coded way to say that I can trust you with money. So this myth exists in part because of various factors, one of which is that there are laws and policies within donor countries that specifically prohibit and prevent money from moving directly from the donor country to a global south organization. That money has to swim through civil society and NGOs based in global north countries before it gets to the global south organization. And that there are many good people, I think, or this is what we came to learn, that there are many good people within the system that also are not aware of this myth and this and the system of tied aid. So to answer your question, I think that this myth in fact existed for a long time because I think many good people did not know about it. But also there were incentives for money to stay with global north organizations.
100%. And we're going to dive into a lot of those issues. I love your phrase. This is one of the best, most well-kept secrets, or one of the best kept secrets in the sector. 100% agree with that. Now, I really want to come back to the name for the campaign and the research that you were talking about. So, Eshban, I'm going to give you all the credit here. You chose the name, Too Southern to Be Funded. It's a brilliant name. And I think it has, for me, an important connotation around, for example, discrimination, perceptions, negative perceptions of the Global South that you were talking there. But I wonder if you could, rewind time a couple of years before and tell us why you came to choose that really, really powerful name.
So a big correction. In fact, I didn't choose the name. The name was chosen by the Shift the Power movement.
Right.
And we thought that the name was fitting because one of the things that the report revealed had been the systematic exclusion of Global South organizations from the funding opportunities in international aid. And that systematic exclusion was strictly based on the fact that those organizations were Southern organizations. So it felt fitting to say that there's such a thing as being too Southern to be funded. The policies and the laws that exist had been designed to privilege Northern organizations over Southern organizations. And that's really where the name comes from, that there's such a thing as being too Southern to ever be funded.
Yeah, and I think it's really powerful. And you've talked a few times about the Shift the Power movement. And I think it's important to say that there are hundreds of and thousands of people and organizations behind the call to change these really, really unfair practices. But I guess if we're zooming all the way out, why do you think these traditional DAC donor countries don't fund Southern organizations more directly? You mentioned the word capacity, and I know you wanted to come back to it because it is such a loaded term. So including capacity and beyond that, what do you think if we put ourselves in their shoes, what is their reasoning? Why has such an incredibly unfair system come into being in the first place?
I want to start by saying that a big part of this is also about money, because the money moves from the development, global north governments, and then it goes through a network of national level civil society NGOs that are based in the global north before it finds its way to southern organizations. And that a big part of why the dark donors or a big part of why global north governments and development agencies don't move the money directly is because in the middle there, especially the global north-based NGOs and civil societies, a narrative has been built that southern civil society organizations can't be trusted with money. They don't have capacity. There are major assumptions around corruption and fraud, and that one has to, and that the international NGOs based in the global north have over the years built the expertise that positions them or best positions them to manage large sums of money. So I want to say that this ultimately comes down to money or power. And, the organizations that control that money also, in effect, control that power. And there's an incentive for them to maintain that narrative or those assumptions that systematically lock out southern civil society. And the thing about systems is that they can be quite powerful, that even good people that operate in them find themselves, playing along or acting and behaving in ways that are compliant to those systems.
Very, very well said. Honestly, it's just incredibly offensive at best.
Yeah. And Eshban, one of the things we want to do with this podcast is to allow people who don't think about development every day and who don't work in the field to also get an insight into really how the system works in practice. What is one or two things that you think the public in countries like the UK and the US, who are some of the big donors, what's one thing you think they should know about the top-down nature of this funding?
I would say that one of the things that they should know is that their money, the money from their governments, was always so difficult to access. So their assumption that their governments have predominantly funded civil society in the global south is wrong. And that I appreciate that within some of these countries, there's a narrative that so much money has been given and yet so little change has been within southern civil society. And what I want them to know is that actually, southern civil society never received the money and that most of it stayed with northern organizations. So if they're asking if there's a bit of fatigue and I guess curiosity or frustration and asking for accountability, they should ask for accountability from the people that received the money and not the southern civil society organizations. So if we establish the premise that a lot of this money was always difficult to access, I would also want them to exercise some curiosity in wondering how have Global South NGOs and civil societies existed all these years, and especially with limited funding. A lot of the complementary funding came from organizing and mobilizing whatever local resources have been available to them, and in some ways complementing those local resources with international money. So the assumption that it was only their governments that supported civil society in the Global South is not true, and that civil society in the Global South has been a mix of local resources and international resources. The last thing would be to say that no one in the Global South really wants to come to their governments to ask for more money. What we want is to start a conversation around supporting southern civil society to build on the local resources that they had already started to mobilize and organize, and to build something more sustainable so that someday we don't have to come back like Oliver Twist and his bowl of gold.
Absolutely. Let's go there, Eshban. Exactly. So what would paint a picture for us? Because I think we all need some hope coming into 2026. What would the world look like if these formal flows of money, where power, as you say, power and all the money is concentrated in the hand of these so-called donors, what if that no longer existed? What can we learn from the alternative systems that already exist, including the ones you started to talk about there?
I think that reality in which the dominant international aid system no longer exists, that reality is quite close. It's just that there's something about the international development system that has captured our imagination so much that it's difficult. It's so difficult for most people to imagine a system in which there is no international development. I mean, I can say this now after the collapse of USA, that some of that has already started to happen. I was in a meeting last year and somebody wrote on a mirror board that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And sometimes I think about international development in that manner, that it's easier to imagine so many things than to imagine the end of international development. And yet, in countries like the US, we've already seen that a lot of that aid has already stopped. In other global south countries, governments are passing laws and legislation to prevent aid from global north countries from getting into southern countries. I think that there's a growing intellectual assault against international aid from different sides of the political divide. And there's quite possibly a future where if one is part of international development in a global north country, it will be so difficult to get their money into a southern country. Having said that, all of that is happening at a time when, for a very long time, and work that has been happening quietly outside the gaze of the international system, organizations for which international money was always so difficult to access, have been quietly building their power and building their local resources so that they can operate in a more sustainable manner. Sometimes this is cash, sometimes it's in-kind resources. And that these organizations within the field of, they go by different names: mutual aid, community philanthropy, local philanthropy. What matters is that they've been building a system away from the dominant system. And that anyone that's interested and curious about what does development work look like, or what does charity type work look like outside the dominant international aid system, kind of has to just tilt their gaze a little bit and look at who are the organizations that have done this work without international aid, and how can we support them in building an alternative system that is already happening. And that alternative system is rooted in mutual aid. It's rooted in local philanthropy. It's rooted in community philanthropy. And it's a system in which giving is very relational based and not necessarily concessional. I mean, we could talk about it for hours, but it's already happening across the world.
I wish we could record a 10-hour-long podcast on this subject, but I think what you've said there is absolutely perfect.
I think we've come to an end.
Yeah.
Eshban, is there anything else you would want to say about this topic or about this subject? It's been fascinating to hear your perspectives and to bring in that element of what's already happening, what's already working. And I love what you said about just shifting your gaze slightly. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
I think that the last thing I would say is that there's been a lot of frustration with how international aid has operated and how it has acted, and the difficulty to access its resources. And there's a quote I love within the Shift the Power movement, and it goes something like this. It's by a guy called Bucky Fuller. Says that it is difficult to fight. I'm paraphrasing now. It's difficult to fight an existing system, but the only way to fight an existing system is to create a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that there are many people who have not found warmth within international philanthropy and within international development, and that those people have stepped away to go to a different table and to build a different kind of table because there was never room for them at the international development table. And the invitation here is for anyone that's curious and is interested in building, an alternative table, to just think about what the field of local philanthropy, community philanthropy, mutual aid, local fundraising looks like, and to come help build that. Because there's something about the dominant system that has become so difficult to break, and that a lot of people, I think, out of the fatigue of trying to change that dominant system and feeling that they are not going anywhere, have moved away and attempting to create something. So if I could use my breath to say one last thing, is that for anybody that's listening to this, if you feel that frustration and that maybe even anger with the dominant system, I think that it's okay to come find other people who are building a way as opposed to trying to reform something that's so difficult to reform.
Amazing, Eshban. Please save 2 seats at that table for us. Huge thanks again, Eshban, for joining us. That was absolutely amazing. It was a masterclass in communication, and quite frankly, it was chef's kiss. Thanks
very
again.
Much to the both of you. I've truly enjoyed this.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. We appreciate your time.
So you've heard it all before, but if you like what you heard, or at the very least are mildly intrigued, please subscribe and take a moment to rate the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram, YouTube, all details in the description below.
You've been amazing, and we've been Take or Give.